The sky still burned with the copper afterglow of spent tracers, when silence first clawed its way through the ringing in my ears. I'd been falling for what felt like hours, though the altitude, cracked and frozen at 9,000 feet, told a different story. My Spitfire, Evening Star, had coughed its last breath somewhere over the Ardennes, one wing sheared clean off by flak so sudden it felt like God himself had swung a scythe through the cockpit. I'd bailed too late, too low, and the chute had snapped open with a violence that wrenched my shoulder from its socket. Now I lay sprawled in a ditch, slick with mud and pine needles, ribbed screaming with every shallow gasp, staring up at a sky that no longer belonged to war. For a moment, there was only the wind. Then the smell hit me: kerosene, scorched metal, and something else, something human. Not blood, not yet. A sharp, sour tang of fear. I rolled onto my side, teeth gritted against the flare of pain in my chest, and scanned the tree line. The crash site wasn't far. Smoke curled lazily from the fuselage, half buried in the underbrush, like a beached whale. No fire, no secondary explosion, just the slow hiss of cooling metal and the low moan of something alive. I dragged myself up, using a birch sapling for leverage, and limped forward. Every step sent needles through my left leg, sprained, maybe broken, but still functional. That was luck, the kind you don't question in enemy territory. My sidearm was still holstered, my survival kitwater, rations, compass, morphine BL, intact in its pouch beneath the ruined flight jacket. I'd need it all. The Krauts would be sweeping this sector within the hour, maybe less. But then I heard it. Not the crunch of boots through frost-hardened leaves, not the bark of German commands. A whimpered, thin, reedy, choked with tears. I froze, hand on my Webley, heart hammering not from injury now but dread. Civilians didn't wander crash sites, not in occupied France, not in winter, not unless they'd lost something or someone. I followed the sound around the tail section, and there he was. A boy, couldn't have been more than 8, kneeling in the mud beside a jagged tear in the fuselage, hands pressed against the aluminum as if he could will the plane back into the sky. His clothes, wool trousers, a threadbare sweater, patched at the elbows, wore, spattered with soot and something darker. Blood, maybe, though not his own. His face was streaked with tears and dirt, eyes wide and glassy with shock. He didn't look at me when I stepped closer, just kept whispering in German, Ober and Ober, Annahme primera di DNT, no, but understood all the same. The realization hit like a second crash. This wasn't an enemy soldier. This wasn't even a collaborator's child. This was a boy who watched his father, Esplenda, very one ID, chased out of formation, the one my squadron had cornered over the Mice Plummet, to earth in flames. And now he was here, alone, kneeling at the altar of his grief, believing maybe, just maybe, that if he stayed still enough, the world might rewind itself. I lowered the pistol. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to vanish into the woods, find shelter, Radio 4 extraction, once I was clear of the perimeter. Protocol was explicit. Do not engage with civilians. Do not reveal position. Do not compromise mission integrity. And yet I stood there, boots sinking into the mud, watching a child grieve a man I'd killed. He finally looked up, eyes the color of storm clouds. No hatred in them. Not yet. Just raw, animal confusion. Like a dog that doesn't understand why its master hasn't come home. I didn't speak German, not beyond the clipped phrases "We the Vendriged on" for PO interrogation Sache, Andy Ho-Ho. Keine Bewegung useless now. So I did the only thing I could think of. I knelt, slow, deliberate, keeping my hands where he could see them, and pulled the canteen from my belt. Unscrewed the cap. Offeriv Italiano. He didn't take it. Just stared at my face, the blood drying on my temple. The RAF wings pinned crookedly to my tunic, the exhaustion etched into every line. Water, I said softly, as if language mattered less than tone. Trinken. A tremor passed through him. He shook his head violently. Once, then buried his face in his arms. The sound that followed wasn't a sob. It was worse. A hollow, broken noise, like something inside him had snapped. I set the canteen down between us. Then the survival pack. Rations for 3 days. A chocolate bar wrapped in greaseproof paper, my last taste of home before takeoff. I left them there, silent offerings in a language even a child could understand. And then I made my choice. Not aloud. Not with fanfare. Just a shift in my stance. A quiet realignment of priorities deeper than doctrine. I couldn't leave him. Not like this. Not knowing patrols would march through here within the hour. Not knowing what they'd do to a boy found weeping over a downed Luftwaffe aircraft, especially if they saw Allied gear beside him. They'd assume collusion, or worse, used him as bait. I reached for the emergency radio strapped to my thigh. The T-13. Short range. Designed for contact with rescue aircraft only. Using it now, this close to the crash, was suicide. It would paint a beacon over our heads, but I keyed the mic anyway, thumb pressing into the cold metal, and whispered the coordinates sent to the static. Not for me. For Ime. Mayday. I breathed. Civilian child. Non-combatant. Location request immediate medevac or ground extraction. Repeat. Non-combatant. Do not engage. I switched frequencies, patched through to base under a false squawk code, hoping to God they'd hear the urgency beneath the calm. The boy looked up again, startled by the crackle of my voice. I met his eyes and gave the smallest nod. Reassurance, or maybe just shared despair. Either way, it was a promise. I'd broken every rule, and I'd do it. Again? The wind shifted just after I keyed the radar, dragging the scent of burnt oil toward the east toward the road. I didn't have long. I crouched beside the boy, not touching him, not yet, but close enough that he could see I wasn't leaving. His name was Emil. I learned a minute later, when he choked it out between breaths, fingers still curled into the damp earth. Emil Weber. His father, Oberleutnant Karl Weber, had flown that Messerschmitt like it was stitched to his bones until Matresa unraveled it over the tree. I didn't tell him that. I didn't say a word about the dogfight, the way his father's plane had spiraled like a dying bird, or how I'd watched the canopy shear off before impact. Instead, I opened the chocolate bar and broke off a square, holding it out like an offering to a wild animal. He took it, not eagerly, but with the exhausted caution of someone who de-learned hunger was empty, always followed by relief. He nibbled the edge, eyes never leaving mine. And for the first time since I'd landed in this god-forsaken patch of woods, something inside me unclenched hoosed slightly. "They'll come," I said, though he wouldn't understand. "Soon." He nodded anyway, as if language had ceased to matter. Maybe it had. Out here, past the front lines, and the radio static, and the brittle shell of military order. All that remained was the raw calculus of survival and mercy. I checked my compass. Northwest lay the extraction point. 8 clicks through dense forest, across 2 streams, and past a derelict rail spur the Germans still patrolled. 8 kilometers with a broken rib and a sprained ankle. Impossible alone. Unthinkable with a child. But I wasn't leaving him. A distant rumble rolled through the trees, not thunder, but engines, trucks. My stomach dropped. I grabbed Emil's wrist, gently but firmly, and pulled him behind the fuselage. He didn't resist. He'd heard it too. His breath hitched, and he pressed himself flat against the scorched metal, eyes wide with the dawning horror of what came next. Soldiers. Not French resistance. Not friendly patrols. The Wehrmacht would treat a civilian boy found near a wrecked enemy aircraft as either a collaborator or a witness, and neither ended well. I drew my Webley, thumbed off the safety, and scanned the tree line. No movement yet, but they'd be methodical. Grid search. Dogs? Maybe. If they found us here, they'd take the boy and execute me on sight. Or worse, keep me alive long enough to extract whatever I knew, which wasn't much, but enough to get others killed. "Stay down," I whispered. though he couldn't understand. I mimed silence, finger to lips, then pointed to the underbrush 20 meters west. Go. Quiet. He shook his head, violently, clutching my sleeve. Not fear of the woods, fear of being left. I wanted to curse, to shout at the universe for handing me this choice, obey the rules that kept men alive or follow the instinct that made us human. But there was no time for philosophy. The engines were closer now, idling just beyond the ridge. I made a decision. I slung my survival pack over my shoulder, scooped a meal up. He was lighter than I expected, all bone and trembling muscle, and ran, not toward the extraction point, not toward safety, but deeper into the woods, toward a ravine I'd spotted during my descent. Steep, shadowed, choked with brambles, useless for vehicles, maybe useless for tracking dogs. Too, if the creek at the bottom washed our scent away, every jolt sent fire through my ribs. But I didn't slow. Behind us, voices barked in German. Boots crunched on frost-hardened leaves. They'd found the crash site. I didn't look back. We hit the ravine's edge and slid down. Emil's arms locked around my neck like a lifeline. Mud and dead ferns cushioned our fall. At the bottom, water icy, shallow rippled over smooth stones. I waded in, dragging him with me, then doubled back along the bank, stepping only on rock, pressing our trail into the current. It wouldn't fool hounds for long, but it might buy us minutes. Here, I hissed, shoving him into a hollow beneath an upturned root. I crouched beside him, breath ragged, gun ready. Above, the voices grew louder. Flashlights cut through the mist. Someone shouted coordinates into a field radio. They were calling in reinforcements. Emil buried his face in my flight jacket, silent now, utterly still. I rested a hand on his head just once and stared up at the sliver of sky visible through the canopy. Somewhere out there, my mayday call was either being ignored or acted upon. If it was the latter, a Lysander might already be circling 50 miles north, waiting for confirmation. If it was the former, we were on our own until nightfall. A twig snapped upstream. I raised the Webley. Boots splashed in the shallows. Not one man. 2. Maybe 3. They moved with the slow confidence of hunters who knew their prey was cornered. I tightened my grip, finger resting beside the trigger. One shot, and they'd swarm the ravine. But if I stayed silent, maybe they'd pass. Emil trembled against my side, not from cold, from terror, and in that moment I realized the truth. I wasn't just risking my life. I was asking a child to trust me with his, a child whose father I'd killed. The irony was almost biblical. The footsteps stopped 20 meters away. A flashlight beam swept the opposite bank. Then another voice higher, younger, cut through the dark. Higher, calm her. They'd found something, not us. A scrap of fabric, my parachute, tangled in the branches. The beam jerked away, following the noise. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, but the reprieve was temporary. They'd circle back, and next time they'd be more thorough. I turned to Emil. Listen to me, I said in English, as if the words themselves could carry meaning through tone alone. We're going to move again. Slow. Quiet. You understand? He nodded, eyes huge in the gloom. I holstered the Webley, slung him onto my back. Piggyback style ignoring the shriek of pain from my ribs end, began to climb the far side of the ravine. Not toward the road, not toward hope, but into the deeper dark, where the trees grew thicker and the world narrowed to the next step, the next breath, the next impossible choice. Dawn came not with light, but with coldest slow seep of gray through the pine boughs that did little to warm us, but everything to expose us. We'd spent the night huddled in the lee of a Moscoved boulder. Emil curled against my side like a wounded animal, my flight jacket draped over both of us. My ribs throbbed, in time with my pulse, and my left ankle had swollen so badly inside my boot, I could barely flex my toes. Still, we'd made it through. No patrols. No dogs. Just the wind and the occasional cry of an owl, and Emil's shallow, restless breathing. He stood as the sky lightened, blinking up at me with eyes still raw from tears, but clearer, now less lost, more watchful. He didn't speak, but he handed me the last piece of chocolate, the one he'd saved. I shook my head, nudged it back toward him. He broke it in half and pressed a piece into my palm. A truce, a language beyond words. We had maybe 2 hours before full daylight, long enough to reach the river if we moved fast. The extraction point was on the far Banca Pharma S-barn, marked with a white ribbon on the west-facing post, according to the map I'd memorized before takeoff. If the resistance still held it, if the Germans hadn't swept it, if the Lysander hadn't been diverted. Too many ifs. But it was all we had. I stood, gritting my teeth, against the stab in my side, and helped Emil up. He flinched when I touched his arm-old bruises, I realized, blooming along his forearm in yellow and violet. Not from the crash. From before. My stomach tightened, but I said nothing. Some wounds didn't need naming. We moved northwest, sticking to the thickest cover, avoiding ridgelines and open clearings. Emil matched my pace without complaint, eyes scanning the ground like he'd done this before. Maybe kids in occupied zones learned to move like shadows, or they didn't survive long. Halfway to the river, I heard it, the low thrum of an aircraft engine, far off but descending. Not a Messerschmitt. Too steady, too slow. A Lysander. They'd come. Hope flared, hot and dangerous. If I could get to the riverbank, signal with my mirror, maybe even fire a flare. But the moment I broke tree line, I'd be visible for kilometers. And Emil? They'd never extract a civilian. Not officially. Not without orders. Which I didn't have. Which I'd never get. The plane circled once, then banked east. My heart sank. They were searching. But not here. Not yet. We reached the river by mid-morning. It was wider than I remembered, fast-moving, ice clinging to the banks, the water slate-gray and churning. No bridge, no ford, just a fallen tree upstream, half-submerged, slick with moss. It would have to do. I tested it with my boot. Solid enough. "Stay close," I murmured, though he couldn't understand. He went fierce, crawling on hands and knees, every shift sending needles through my ankle. Halfway across, the trunk groaned under my weight. I froze. Emil waited on the far bank, eyes wide, then a shout. Downstream, German voices, not distant this time. Close. Too close. I scrambled the last few meters, grabbed Emil's arm, and yanked him into the thicket on the opposite side. We crouched, breath held, as boots pounded the opposite bank. 2 soldiers, then 4. They'd followed our trail, or worse, they'd been waiting. One of them raised a rifle, scanning the tree line. Another unslung a radio. I pulled Emil lower, shielding his body with mine, fingers curling around the grip of my Webley. If they crossed, I'd have one shot before they returned fire. One chance to get him away. But they didn't cross. They argued in sharp, clipped tones, then turned and jogged east toward the sound of the circling plane. They thought the pilot was alone. That gave us minutes. Maybe. Then I turned to Emil. "We run," I said, and pointed toward the barn 2 clicks west, just beyond a copse of birches. He nodded once, jaws set. Not a child anymore. A survivor. We ran. Legs burning, lungs on fire, I pushed through the pain, dragging Emil when he stumbled, never letting go. The barn rose ahead, its roof sagging but intact, the white ribbon fluttering like a promise. I fumbled for the signal mirror in my pocket, angled it toward the sky. 1 flash. 2. A third in the pattern we'd drilled. Friendlies with civilian. Urgent exfil. The Lysander banked hard, turned toward us. We burst into the barn just as the engine noise peaked overhead. Straw littered the floor, the scent of hay and manure thick in the air. No one inside. No resistance. Just silence and dust motes, dancing in the slanted light. I shoved Emil into a stall, crouched beside him, and drew my sidearm. If this was a trap, we'd go down fighting. But then movement in the loft. A face peered over the edge. Young, French, a red armband with the cross of Lorraine, he whispered. I nodded. And a boy. German. Civilian. The fighter hesitated just. A heartbeat, then nodded back. Attende. He vanished. Seconds later, a rope ladder tumbled from the loft. Above, the Lysander descended, impossibly low, its engine a roar that shook the walls. Go! I shoved Emil toward the ladder. He climbed, clumsy with fear, and disappeared into the belly of the plane. I followed, hauling myself up with the last of my strength, collapsing onto the metal floor as the pilot gunned the engine. The Lysander leapt skyward, wheels clearing the roof by inches. Inside, Emil clung to a support strut, eyes wide with terror and wonder. The pilot glanced back, just once, then pointed to a headset hanging from the fuselage. I put it on. Who the hell is that kid? The voice crackled. A witness, I said, to Mercy. The pilot didn't respond, just banks north, toward the channel. Toward home. I looked at Emil. He looked back, silent, but in his eyes, something had shifted. Not gratitude, not yet, but the first fragile glimmer of belief that maybe not all enemies were monsters, that maybe the world could still surprise you with kindness, even in the wreckage of war. I slumped against the bulkhead, closed my eyes, and let the roar of the engine drown out everything but the weight of what I'd done. Illegal, reckless, maybe traitorous, and utterly right. The channel stretched beneath us like liquid pewter, streaked with dawn's first gold. Emil sat hunched against the fuselage, knees drawn to his chest, eyes fixed on the coastline receding behind us. He hadn't spoken since we'd lifted off, not in fear, not in wonder, just silence, the kind that follows when a child stops, expecting the world to make sense. Primera lea, Ned barked, wincing as Myribus protested, and studied him. His hair was matted with soot and pine needles, his sweater torn at the shoulder, but his hands were clean, now scrubbed with the water the Resistance handed us before we boarded. Small mercies, te added up. The pilot, a wiry Scot, named McAllister, with oil-stained fingers and a jaw set like granite, glanced back once. HQ's buzzing, he said into the intercom, his voice crackling through my headset. They want to know who the hell that kid is and why. I risked a bird for him. I didn't answer right away. I looked at Emil again. He met my gaze, this time steady, searching, not grateful, not yet, but present, awake. That was enough. Tell them he's a witness, I said finally, to what happens when you choose humanity over orders. McAllister snorted, but there was no heat in it. And tell that to the tribunal when they court-martial your ours. He wasn't wrong. Using a rescue frequency for a civilian, especially a German civilian, was a clear violation of Article 17 of the RAF Code of Conduct. Command would call it reckless endangerment, a breach of operational security, maybe even treason if they were feeling dramatic. I'd be grounded at best, imprisoned at worst, but as the white cliffs of Dover rose ahead, sharp and defiant against the gray sea, I couldn't bring myself to regret it, because Emil wasn't just a boy. He was the war's sharpest paradox, an enemy who'd done nothing but lose. His father had worn the eagle and swastika, yes, but this child had only known hunger, fear, and the sound of bombers overhead. And in that ravine, when he'd taken my hand instead of running, he'd handed me something more valuable than intel or victory. A chance to be more than a weapon. We touched down at Ref Westmoreland just after 0800. Ground crew swarmed the Lysander before the props even stopped spinning. Officers in crisp tunics appeared moments later, faces tight with urgency. One of them, a squadron leader, with a scar bisecting his eyebrows, strode straight to me as I helped Emil down from the cockpit. Care to explain this? He demanded, nodding at the boy. He was at the crash site, I said. Alone. No adults, no soldiers. Just a child caught in the crossfire. And you brought him here? I radioed for extraction. You responded. You used a Mayday channel for a civilian. I held his stare. I used it for a human being. He exhaled sharply, jaw ticking. Then, to my surprise, he turned to Emil and knelt, hushed slightly, so they were eye to eye. "What's your name, son?" "Emil," the boy whispered. "Emil," the squadron leader repeated. "Softer now. We're going to get you something to eat and a warm place to sit." "All right." Emil nodded. Once. The officer stood and nodded to a WAF nearby. "Find him a bunk in the infirmary. Hot meal and call the Red Cross. Civilian intake protocol." As they led Emil away, he glanced back at me. I gave him the smallest nod. "You're safe now." Then the squadron leader turned to me. "You're relieved of duty, Flight Lieutenant. Report to Group Captain Harrow at 1400. Bring your logbook and your sidearm." "Yes, sir," Asita said, then added quietly, "and well done. No fanfare, no medals, just 3 words. That meant more than any citation ever could." The hearing lasted less than an hour. Harrow, a veteran of Dunkirk, with eyes like flint and a voice that brooked no nonsense, read my report without expression. Then he set it down, folded his hands, and stared at me for a long moment. "You knowingly violated standing orders," he said. "You compromised your position, exposed a rescue channel to potential enemy interception, and brought an unvetted civilian onto a secure airfield." "Yes, sir. Do you understand the gravity of that?" "I do." He leaned back, fingers drumming the desk. The boy's father was Karl Weber, Oberleutnant Jagdgeschwader 26. Shot down 3 of ours over Normandy last spring. "You killed him." "I did." "And yet you saved his son." "I did." Harrow was silent for a long time. Outside, rain began to fall soft, steady English rain that smelled of wet earth and coming spring. Finally, he stood, walked to the window, and watched it fall. "The war's over in all but name," he said, almost to himself. "Soon we'll be picking up the pieces. Rebuilding, trying to remember what it means to be human after years of turning boys into killers." He turned back to me. "What you did, it wasn't regulation, but maybe it was necessary." He sat again, opened a file, and stamped it with a single word. "Closed." "You're reassigned," he said. "Effective Monday. Transport command. Ferrying supplies to the occupation zone. And while you're there—" He paused, then met my eyes. "See if you can find that boy's mother, if she's still alive. Give him a chance at something resembling a life." I blinked. "Sir, you're not charging me." Harrow gave a dry, humorless laugh. "Son, if I court-martialed every pilot who broke the rules to do the right thing, this squadron would be empty." 2 months later, I stood on a rubble-strewn street in Hamburg, Emil's hand in mine, staring at a doorway where his mother, Esnam Vaber, was still faintly visible beneath layers of soot and ash. She opened the door, thin, hollow-eyed, but alive. When she saw Emil, she dropped to her knees and pulled him into her arms so fiercely I thought she might never let go. I stepped back, didn't speak, just watched as the impossible became real. Later, as I walked back to the airfield, a British nurse stopped me on the street. "That the boy from France?" she asked. I nodded. She smiled. "He talks about you. Calls you der pilot, MIT dem Herson." The pilot with a heart, I didn't know what to say to that. So I just tipped my cap and kept walking. The war had taught me to kill. But in a muddy ravine, with a child's trembling hand in mine, it also taught me how to live, and sometimes that was the more dangerous mission of all.